So the Siroolac glass pad has been an absolute blast for me to use over the last few days. I've really enjoyed it because it isn't pushing the extremes of speed. I can relax into it a little bit more. It's a really balanced surface and I genuinely, as I've said, I've really enjoyed it. I want to say a big thank you to those of you that subscribe to the channel and frequently like the videos. I see you, I appreciate you, legends. Let's get into the video. So the sizing of the Siroolac 2.0 glass pad is a little bit unusual. It breaks the mold a little bit. So typically glass pads are 490 by 420 and the large option, which is the one I've got here, is 480 by 400. So it's a little bit smaller in both dimensions, but it isn't too small for me. You know, those couple of centimeters here or there hasn't made a big difference in the way that it feels to use. So that isn't a con, it's just something to be aware of. There is also a small version, which is 350 by 300, and that's really for you fingertip, grippers, high sense gamers out there that just use, just their wrist and their fingers really. Arm aimers, you'd want to go for the bigger option. So the pad is also advertised at 2.6 millimeters thick, which makes it really unnoticeable on my desk, which is a good thing because the edges aren't tapered or rounded at all. They aren't sharp, but they are very square. I haven't noticed any issues with it on my wrist or on my arm, but I would definitely like to see some tapers or rounding to the edges as a quality of life improvement if they ever make a Siroolac 3.0. So the Siroolac 2.0 also has a full silicone base, but an issue with this that I have on my cheap desk is that it doesn't actually lock to the surface very well. So as you can see, I can just pull it around, and because it is a little bit sticky to my skin, and we'll cover that more later, you'll notice that sort of after a session, it's not exactly where I left it in terms of its position on a desk. With reference to the design then, I actually really enjoy having a basic block color design on the desk occasionally, and this one looks and feels really nice and clean in my opinion. I also love this logo. It's just a mad rat wielding a shotgun. Look at this fella. It looks like he's going to bite your nose off. And it's just, it's really fun. It's maybe my favorite logo of any brand, and if I'm being really honest with you, it's the reason why I accepted the unit for the review, because the logo just looked really fun to me. So the surface is textured. It feels nice on my fingers. It's not too noticeable in use, if I'm honest with you, but it isn't as smooth to touch as something like the SP004 as the example. So I do have to wear a sleeve when I use this pad because it does stick to my skin. It's not super sticky, but I notice it tug when I'm using lower sensitivity. But I do typically prefer not to feel tugging when I'm gaming and aiming, and the Pulsar ES palm long sleeve is still my go-to these days. So in terms of performance characteristics then, the Siroolac 2.0 is really nicely balanced, as I've already said. It isn't as fast as some of the other options on the market. I don't have any floating at the end of my swipes. I can bring the cursor to a nice controlled stop without any wriggle, and I found my flicks to be just as good as my tracking on this surface, which is unusual for me when I'm using glass. That's why I typically gravitate to the Kinect when I want to use glass. But with this pad, I've now got a glass surface that I can use for similar aiming scenarios. I tend to struggle with my flicks, my sort of clicking scenarios compared to my tracking. I can track typically on any surface, it's the clicking that I struggle with. So the initial friction on the Siroolac 2.0 is slightly elevated when compared to something like the SP004, but it isn't as sticky or as noticeable as it is on the Kinect. You might just notice it in your micro adjustments if you spend a lot of time in aim trainers. So in terms of dynamic glide, it's got less speed than something like the SP004, but the inherent speed associated with glass pad generally means that this is still a fast pad. It's just not at the extremes of speed. The stopping power that you get feels really nice to me. It's not overwhelming in that regard, but it definitely supports you coming to a manageable stop. And I think that this is the perfect combination of characteristics for me on a glass pad. So I've really enjoyed using the Siroolac 2.0, genuinely, and I fragged out pretty hard in Apex over the last few days doing so, and I've done that when I've managed to drag myself away from my trackball. So I've absolutely fallen in love with the Game Ball trackball, and if you're interested in other input devices, you should stick around because I'm going to release a really in-depth video on this one in the next few weeks. So when I am able to pull myself away from the trackball, I'm enjoying the X2H Crazy Light Mini on this pad. And I've just got the default skates, which is an absolute travesty, but I've just got used to it. It doesn't feel too bad to me. And I'm also still enjoying the green ASIM with the Ghost Glides BFD dots on here. I will eventually put some Cyclone Pros on the X2H Mini Crazy Light, but I just haven't got around to doing it yet. And honestly, as I say, I've got used to it and it seems to work well enough for me at the moment. So the pad will arrive in this sort of basic but very sturdy cardboard box. You know, it's quite handy to keep the pad in when it's not in use. It's full of this foam and it's quite used in terms of keeping the pad safe. It's done a really, really good job. The pad has arrived without any scrapes and any warping on it. We also get a nice little Siroolac sort of cleaning cloth too, which is handy just to wipe down dust particles. The cloth, the pad, and a nice box to keep it in terms of, you know, keeping it safe in your house when it's not in use. I actually really rate the box. Even though it's basic, it's really handy to have something like this to keep it in when you're not using it. So I want to talk a little bit about cost here too. And in the UK, the Siroolac 2.0 sits in a bit of a strange place on the market with reference to its price, where it isn't a budget option and it also isn't a premium option in terms of where it sits price-wise. So if you're buying the larger option, it's currently selling for £87 on Amazon, and the smaller one will set you back £69, which is just a brilliant price for anything. You can currently apply a 10% voucher on Amazon, which will just help to bring the price down a little bit further. And I don't think that 10% voucher will be there forever, but it's there at the moment if you're interested. So I do want to say a big thank you to Siroolac for sending me this pad to review. I've genuinely really enjoyed it, and I hope that this helps you, the consumers, you know, the buyers, decide if it's the right one for you or not going forwards. And I'd suggest, you know, really who this pad is for is someone that wants to experience the benefits of a glass pad, so the super consistency, you know, something that is easy to clean little and often because you'll be wiping off those dust particles, but it won't be degrading over time, and it certainly won't be throwing off your aim because the performance characteristics aren't insanely fast. They're quite manageable, quite enjoyable. So that's it. That's my recommendation. I've really enjoyed this one. Log out. Peace.